I might thank you for that. I might be putting you a bit on the spot on this one, so apologies if I am. But you mentioned PE a couple of times. Just for members who are watching this video who might not know what permanent establishment is or permanent establishment risk is, are you able to kind of just articulate that?
Yeah, it's a fixed place of business where a company conducts its activities via, I think, what's called a dependent agent. Okay, so it means you've got someone there that is conducting business on your behalf. That definition obviously varies state to state, country to country. There are treaties versus local laws. But by and large, if you are operating in a country and you have a person there that is, in Brazil, the bar is much lower. In other countries, it'll be, let's say they're signing commercial contracts, they're statistically important to the business, they are generating business in that area. There are a ton of different kind of milestones and markers. But essentially what it has is it has a taxable impact. So foreign companies where there is the establishment or a proven permanent establishment are subject to corporate income tax, typically on profitable attribution from that establishment. So, for example, you sign a bunch of contracts for $1 million that is conducted in the US, but the salesperson has signed it in Brazil, for example, then theoretically, there is the Brazilian state has a view that that £1 million was generated in the local market, and therefore there is a taxable event that occurs to that revenue, which is obviously what people are very keen to avoid, because the reality is that's not really how it feels in a business or how it happens. But tax law wasn't written for remote work. Okay, so and we can't change that overnight. We have to be just mindful of how it works and operate around it, which is why in a lot of these markets, not to sell our own services, but employer of record diminishes a lot of that risk. Not always, and I said case by case, but in many cases you can diminish some of that risk with employer of record.
Thanks for going with that. That's something that we get asked or looked up a lot, is around the PE risks and what it means. So kind of good to get that.
Yeah.
Overview.
It's just when you've got like a ton of contracts and you think, well, that's kind of inconsequential. And it's not. I think that the other thing is it's about risk. All of these things are about risk. Risk appetite determines what course of action you should take. And that's up to each individual business to operate within or understand. The one thing I would encourage is it's fine to say that it's about risk management. I think that what's important to note is for our HR colleagues, it's important for them to make their leadership and board aware of what the actual risks are, right? So, the implied risk might be smaller in, let's say, the world net is closing. There are less and less countries where the risk is limited. But I'll just pick an example. It might be lower in Uruguay than it is in Brazil. And in Brazil, it might be actually very significant. It might be so meaningfully significant that the board needs to discuss how they're going to treat that risk. And that's fine if people then decide that they're going to take that risk. But I think it's the knowing, the head in the sand attitude isn't appropriate for countries where the risk is much greater than you realize.
Yes, yeah. And the fines and the impact can be quite high as well from these.
I mean, we've seen monster fines, and companies don't disclose them because it's not something you want to talk about. You don't say, hey, by the way, so these things are often kind of kept quite quiet, but we've seen some very, very sizable events sometimes in countries you wouldn't expect.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. To kind of just move it back onto the kind of the graduation element and bring it, I guess, we're obviously global, but we have a very strong presence in Europe, being based in the UK and being that kind of the bridge for reaching out to different parts of the world. How does Europe and the graduation model kind of impact? Does it work easier in Europe to go from EOR to entity, or is there more challenges with the regulations coming in?
Yes and no. I mean, we're probably more comfortable with it because we're European, right? We've got people all over Europe. We're dotted in 8 or 9 other countries. We have our own entities and have had for a very long time in all of these markets. We've been through the mill, so we know we've got the scar tissue of knowing exactly. So for us, it feels easy. I still think that if you're an American looking at the market, you would have a different perspective. So important to say. Is it easier? I think that the crossover point is often easier to articulate. The one thing I'd say is that language is a big language is one of those elements that probably doesn't make it onto the spreadsheet first, but probably should. So if you are trying to operate in Germany, the technical crossover point that Claude or ChatGPT might give you is probably relatively early. But do you have the operating capability to manage the German notices that are provided sometimes in the post? Do you have that set up? You need, and this is where I think we've kind of nailed it, is by providing the wrapper, is saying, look, set up your own entity because it's a thing that you should be doing at your stage. But you need to retain some element of compliance. You need to still run your own businesses. You need to not wake up in the middle of the night worrying about what a individual in the Netherlands is going to do if they're on sick leave and you want to let them go. You don't want to have to call up a Magic Circle law firm to be able to provide you with advice because you don't know where to go. There is this kind of advisory wrapper that I think is probably critical in Europe because of the language element that I think most companies should adopt, even if you want to do it on your own later on. We've got companies that eventually have hired their own HR people in Portugal or whatever it might be. But it is smoothing out those transitions that is the critical element of our business, advising you when to be in EOR, advising you when to do your own entity, but sort of helping you through that process. I've got a great example. We have a client where they set up in the Netherlands, and they had a problem setting up their bank. If anything, by the way, is a delayer on setting up your entity, it is the bank.